Glass shattered against mahogany, missing her head by inches. Dante Moretti owned half this city and buried the rest. She was just a maid clutching a silver tray, paid to be invisible. But when he cursed a collapsing arms deal in brutally broken Russian, she didn't cower. She corrected his syntax. Then she did it in French, then Spanish. By midnight, the most dangerous man in the syndicate didn't want blood. He only wanted her. Dust does not settle in the Moretti estate. It is wiped away before it can land, eradicated by an army of silent women in starch-stiffened uniforms. Lucy Warren was one of them. For 8 months, she had been a ghost haunting the sprawling corridors of the compound, her existence defined by the scent of lemon polish and the heavy metallic tang of blood she was sometimes asked to scrub from the hardwood floors. She preferred the blood to the men. The men who populated Dante Moretti's inner circle were loud, volatile, and stupid. Dante was different. He wasn't loud. He was a quiet, suffocating kind of dangerous. When he walked into a room, the air pressure dropped. He was a man fighting a war on 4 fronts, inheriting a fractured syndicate from a father who had valued loyalty over competence. Now Dante was surrounded by aging capos who couldn't read a ledger, let alone navigate the complexities of global smuggling routes. It was Tuesday evening. The storm outside battered the floor-to-ceiling windows of the dining room. Lucy stood perfectly still in the corner, holding a silver tray bearing a single porcelain coffee pot. She was waiting for the nod to pour. At the long table, Dante sat with his knuckles pressed to his mouth. Across from him, Enzo, a lieutenant with more scar tissue than brain cells, was arguing with a sweaty, nervous man named Felix. Felix was supposed to be the syndicate's translator. Between them sat a tape recorder. "Play it again," Dante said. His voice was a low rasp, exhausted and absolute. Felix's trembling finger pressed the button. The tape hissed, and a heavy, gravelly voice filled the room, speaking in rapid, idiomatic Russian. It was Mikhail Ivanov, the Mafia Boss holding the keys to the eastern docks. The tape clicked off. Dante looked at Felix. Well, Felix swallowed hard, tugging at his collar. He's angry, boss. He says the deal is off. He says they are preparing to strike at the docks tonight. We need to send a crew down there to intercept them before they burn the shipments. Enzo slammed his fist on the table. "I told you, we go in hard. We take the docks back." Dante didn't move. He stared at the tape recorder. His dark eyes narrowed. He looked like a man trying to defuse a bomb in the dark. He hated sloppy intelligence. He hated moving blindly. Lucy stood in her corner. Her pulse was a dull, rhythmic thud in her throat. Her knuckles turned white around the edges of the silver tray. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper. "Don't speak," she told herself. "You are furniture. Furniture does not speak." But she couldn't help it. Her father had been a linguistics professor, a brilliant, manic man who dragged her through 20 different countries before gambling away his pension, his reputation, and eventually his life to men exactly like the ones sitting at this table. She had inherited his ear for syntax and his debt. She was working off 50 grand, $20 at a time, armed with a feather duster. Language was the only thing in her life that made sense. It had rules, it had structure, and Felix was butchering it. Dante rubbed his temples. "Prepare the men, Enzo. If Ivanov wants a war—" "He doesn't," Lucy whispered. The words slipped out. A fatal error. The room went dead silent. The rain lashing against the glass suddenly sounded like gunfire. Enzo stopped halfway out of his chair. Felix gaped. Dante slowly, very slowly, turned his head to look at the corner of the room. He didn't yell. He just looked at her. It was a gaze that felt like a physical weight pressing against her chest. "What did you say?" Dante asked. Lucy's hands shook. The china on the tray rattled, a pathetic, fragile sound. She wanted to shrink into the wallpaper. Nothing, sir. I apologize." "Put the tray down," Dante commanded. She did. The silver clinked against the credenza. "Come here." She walked toward the table on legs that felt like they were made of ash. She stopped a few feet from his chair, keeping her eyes fixed on the knot of his dark silk tie. "Repeat what you said," Dante murmured. "I shouldn't have spoken," Lucy said, her voice trembling. "I'll go back to the kitchens." "If you move, Enzo will shoot you," Dante said, entirely conversationally. "Now tell me what you meant." Lucy took a shallow breath. She looked past him, to the tape recorder. "The translator. He's wrong. Ivanov didn't say he was preparing to strike." Felix flushed dark red. "Listen to me, you little sweeping brush. I spent 2 years in Moscow." "Shut up, Felix," Dante snapped, his eyes never leaving Lucy. "Go on." "It's a dialect from the Ural region," Lucy said, her voice gaining a fraction of steadiness as the mechanics of the language took over. "He used the word odstupat, but in the context of the preceding idiom about wolves and winter. He isn't saying he's attacking the docks. He's saying the local police raided the warehouse. He's warning you to stay away. He's withdrawing his men to protect your shipments, not burning them. If you send a heavily armed crew down there right now, they will walk straight into a federal sting." Silence stretched tight across the room, thin as piano wire. Dante stared at her. He looked at her drab grey uniform, her sensible black shoes, her messy bun. He looked at her like he was seeing a hidden door in a room he had lived in his entire life. He reached out and pressed the button on the tape recorder himself. He listened to the Russian. He didn't understand the words, but he listened to the cadence. Then he looked at Felix. The translator was sweating profusely, his eyes darting toward the door. "Felix," Dante said softly, "is it possible you missed a localized idiom?" It's a chaotic tape, boss. The audio is bad." Dante didn't even raise his voice. "Enzo, take Felix to the garage. Explain to him the cost of bad translation." "No, wait, boss!" Felix stammered, but Enzo was already hauling him up by his collar, dragging him out of the room. The heavy oak doors clicked shut. They were alone. Dante leaned back in his chair. The dangerous, suffocating air in the room hadn't dissipated. It had just focused entirely on her. "Pour the coffee," he said. Lucy stepped forward, her hands steadying. She poured the black liquid into his cup. "What's your name?" he asked, watching the curve of her wrist. Lucy Warren." "Well, Lucy Warren," Dante said, taking a sip of the bitter brew. "You just saved me $2 million and a dozen men. I think you're done scrubbing my floors." He moved her into the study. It wasn't a promotion she wanted. In the kitchens, she had been safe in her anonymity. In the study, a massive wood-panelled room lined with leather-bound books and smelling of scotch and gunpowder, she was terrifyingly visible. Dante didn't fire the rest of the cleaning staff, but he explicitly ordered that Lucy was the only one allowed in his workspace. She was to manage his files, clean his desk, and, most importantly, be present. 2 days passed. The tension in the house was palpable. Enzo looked at her with blatant suspicion. The other maids wouldn't speak to her. On Thursday afternoon, Lucy was organizing a stack of shipping manifests near the window. Dante was at his desk, the phone pressed to his ear. He was speaking in French to a Corsican supplier who managed the maritime routes into the city. Dante's French was passable, but it was rigid. It was textbook French, stripped of the nuance required to navigate the muddy waters of the European underworld. "Yes, the percentage is acceptable," Dante said into the receiver. 30% upon arrival, the rest when the containers clear customs. The man on the other end laughed, a reedy grating sound that echoed out of the earpiece. The Corsican spoke rapidly, a torrent of slang and coastal dialect. Dante frowned, rubbing his jaw. "Agreed. We take the loss on the first container, but the route remains secure." By the window, Lucy froze. She had the duster in her hand. The Corsican hadn't said the route was secure. She looked at Dante. He was about to confirm the deal. If he said yes, he was signing away a fortune. She abandoned the duster. She walked briskly to his desk, grabbed a heavy silver pen, and pulled a piece of Dante's personalized stationery toward her. Dante paused, watching her with a raised brow as the Corsican continued to blather on the phone. Lucy wrote fast, her handwriting sharp and jagged. He just called you a chained dog. He said he will take the loss on the first container, but he is charging you for the customs bribes moving forward. It's an extortion loop." She slid the paper across the mahogany. Dante read it. His expression didn't change, but a muscle in his jaw feathered. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. He didn't cover the receiver. He didn't question her. He simply trusted the translation. "Jean-Luc," Dante said smoothly, switching back to French. "I am not a dog, and I do not wear a chain. And if you attempt to slip customs bribes into my overhead again, I will have your boats sunk in the harbor with you chained to the steering column. The deal is dead." He hung up the phone. He looked at the piece of paper, then up at Lucy. She was already stepping back, her hands clasped in front of her grey apron. "Russian and French," Dante said. It wasn't a question. "Your file says you're paying off your father's gambling debt. It doesn't say your father raised a polyglot." "My father believed language was the only true currency," Lucy said quietly. "We lived in Paris for 3 years, Moscow for 4. Where else? It doesn't matter." "It matters to me." Dante stood up. He walked around the desk. He was a tall man, moving with the predatory grace of someone who had survived this long by anticipating the knife in the dark. He stopped just inches from her. She had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "Are you afraid of me, Lucy?" he asked. "Yes. Good. That means you're not stupid. But I need to know if you're useful." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded document. He handed it to her. "Read this." Lucy took it. It was thick, heavy paper. The text was Spanish. "A cartel out of Sinaloa," Dante explained, crossing his arms. "They want to partner on a distribution network. My lawyers looked at it. They say it's clean." Lucy scanned the document. Her eyes tracked over the dense legal jargon. Spanish was easy. Spanish was math. She reached the 4th page. She stopped. She read the paragraph again, her brow furrowing. "Your lawyers are either incompetent or they've been bought," Lucy said, her voice dropping its customary subservience. The language took over. The puzzle demanded solving. Paragraph 4, subsection C. They used a phrasing here, bienes retenidos. On the surface, it means retained goods, but in the context of their specific municipal laws, which this contract cites in the preamble, it gives them the legal right to classify your distribution hubs as their sovereign assets in the event of a dispute. She looked up at him. "They aren't partnering with you. They're waiting for a disagreement so they can legally seize your warehouses." Dante stared at her. The silence stretched again, but this time it wasn't heavy with threat. It was thick with a sudden, sharp heat. He was looking at her lips as they formed the words, tracking the intelligence burning in her eyes. He reached out. For a second, Lucy thought he was going to strike her. Instead, his fingers brushed against the knot of her apron strings at her waist. With a swift, deft motion, he pulled the string. The knot gave way. "Take it off," he said softly. Lucy's breath hitched. "Mr. Moretti—" "Take the apron off, Lucy. You're never wearing it again." He took a step closer, crowding her against the edge of the desk. "Tonight, I am hosting the Germans, and you are going to sit right beside me." She had never worn a dress like this. It had been delivered to her small room in the servants' quarters just after sunset. Black silk, long sleeves, a high neckline, but tailored so flawlessly it felt like a second skin. It wasn't meant to be seductive. It was meant to be armor. It commanded respect without drawing fire. When she walked into the study at 10 o'clock, Dante was pouring a drink. He stopped. The crystal decanter hovered over the glass. He didn't offer a crude compliment. He didn't smile. He just swallowed hard, set the bottle down, and offered her his arm. "They are waiting in the boardroom," he said. The boardroom was a glass-walled vault at the top of the Moretti Tower downtown. The rain had cleared, leaving the city slick and glittering below them. Sitting at the table were 3 men. 2 were German, importers who controlled the steel shipments that hid Dante's contraband. The 3rd was a surprise, an Egyptian trafficker, Tariq, who controlled the Mediterranean shipping lanes. Dante took his seat at the head of the table. Lucy sat to his right. She had a notepad and a pen. She'd kept her eyes down, but she felt the leering, dismissive gazes of the men across the table. "A new secretary, Moretti?" The lead German, Klaus, asked in heavily accented English, chuckling. "An advisor," Dante replied coldly. "Let's begin." For an hour, they hammered out the logistics of the steel shipments. Klaus spoke English, but whenever he turned to his partner, he spoke in rapid, guttural German. They thought she was just eye candy. They thought Dante was arrogant and exposed. Klaus leaned back, switching to German to speak to his associate. "Push for the 20% tariff. He's desperate. His eastern docks are frozen. He will fold." Lucy didn't miss a beat. She leaned toward Dante, her lips inches from his ear. The scent of his cologne, cedar and smoke, made her head spin, but she kept her voice perfectly level. "He knows about the eastern docks," she whispered. "He thinks you're desperate. Call his bluff. Tell him you have a secondary route through the Southern Railway and you don't need his steel." Dante didn't flinch. He leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Klaus," he said, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "I am not entertaining your 20% tariff. In fact, considering I'd just secured the Southern Railway lines, I am perfectly comfortable walking away from your steel entirely. 10%, or you can go back to Munich empty-handed." Klaus's smug smile vanished. The color drained from his face. He looked at his partner, then at Dante, and finally his eyes snapped to Lucy. 10% is agreeable," Klaus gritted out. The night ground on. It was approaching midnight. The city below was quiet, but the boardroom was a pressure cooker. Tariq, the Egyptian trafficker, had been silent most of the night. He was a dangerous man, known for smiling while he slit throats. He pushed a folder across the table toward Dante. "My terms," Tariq said in English. "For the Mediterranean lanes." Dante opened the folder. It was standard. Too standard. Tariq leaned back and looked at Lucy. He smiled, a slow, predatory baring of teeth. He spoke in Arabic, his voice smooth and mocking. "I am going to bleed this Italian fool dry, and when I am done, I will take you back to Alexandria to warm my bed." Tariq assumed he was safe. Arabic was a fortress. Dante's crew was strictly European. Dante frowned, sensing the shift in tone. "What did he say?" he asked Lucy. Lucy didn't write it on the notepad. She didn't whisper it in Dante's ear. She placed her pen down on the glass table. The click echoed loudly in the quiet room. She looked Tariq dead in the eyes. She didn't speak in English. She spoke in flawless, razor-sharp Arabic. "The Italian fool is currently sitting across from a dead man," Lucy said, her voice dropping into a register of icy authority she didn't know she possessed. "If you attempt to alter the shipping ledgers, Mr. Moretti will not simply kill you. He will have your Mediterranean fleet dismantled and sold for scrap, and he will bury you under the ruins of your own ignorance. As for Alexandria, I prefer the cold." Tariq froze. His confident smile shattered into a look of absolute horror. Dante didn't speak a word of Arabic, but he understood the universal language of power. He watched Tariq visibly shrink into his chair. He watched the man sweat. Then Dante looked at Lucy. His chest rose and fell with a heavy, ragged breath. The look in his eyes wasn't just admiration. It was total, consuming possession. "The deal is concluded," Dante said softly, standing up. "Get out, all of you." The men scrambled to gather their papers. They couldn't leave fast enough. Within seconds, the heavy glass doors sealed shut. The clock on the wall clicked. Midnight. They were alone. The sprawling lights of the city painted the dark room in shades of amber and gold. Lucy stood up, suddenly feeling the adrenaline crash. Her hands began to shake. She reached for her notepad, needing something to ground her. Dante's hand shot out. He caught her wrist. His grip was tight, burning hot against her cold skin. He pulled her around the table. He didn't stop until her back was pressed against the glass wall overlooking the city, his body bracketing hers. 5, Dante breathed, his voice a rough, dark rasp. Russian, French, Spanish, German, Arabic. I just translate, Mr. Moretti," she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs, her breath catching as he stepped impossibly closer. "No," Dante said, his gaze dropping to her mouth. He reached up, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, feeling the frantic flutter of her pulse. "You don't just translate, Lucy. You take the chaos and you bend it to your will." He leaned in, his lips brushing against the shell of her ear. "Now," he murmured, his voice sending a violent shiver down her spine. "Translate this." He didn't wait for her to answer. Dante kissed her the way he did everything else, with absolute, terrifying precision. There was no hesitation, no gentle inquiry. His mouth crushed down on hers, demanding and harsh, tasting of expensive scotch and the raw, electric adrenaline of the boardroom. Lucy gasped, the sound swallowed instantly by him. For a fraction of a second, her hands flew up to push him away. He was a warlord. He was the man who had bought her father's debt and, by extension, her life. But the moment her palms hit the solid wall of his chest, the resistance died in her throat. She gripped the lapels of his suit instead, holding on as the room seemed to tilt. The cold glass of the window bit into her spine, a sharp contrast to the blistering heat of his body pressing against hers. He tasted like smoke and power. It wasn't a romantic kiss, it was an interrogation. He was asking her without words if she could survive this. She kissed him back. She met the bruising pressure of his mouth with a fierce, answering heat, pouring every ounce of her caged intellect, her frustration, and her suppressed rage into the response. Dante groaned, a low, rough sound that reverberated against her chest. One of his hands tangled in her hair, pulling her head back to deepen the angle, while his other arm banded around her waist, lifting her slightly off her feet. He broke the kiss only when the need for oxygen became absolute. They stood there in the silent boardroom, chests heaving, the neon bleed of the city painting their faces in harsh shadows. Dante rested his forehead against hers. His eyes, usually cold and unreadable, were pitch black, dilated with a raw, predatory hunger. "You are going to ruin my life," he whispered, his voice jagged. "You ruined mine first," Lucy breathed back. A stark, cynical smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. "Fair." He stepped back, smoothing the front of his jacket with a completely steady hand. The warlord was back, sliding perfectly behind his mask of control. He offered his arm. Lucy took it, her knees trembling slightly, though she locked her jaw to hide it. The ride back to the estate was silent. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of fear, but the charged, dangerous quiet of a bomb counting down. The transition happened the next morning. Lucy did not wake up in the cramped, windowless servants' quarters on the ground floor. She woke up in a massive, king-sized bed, wrapped in high thread-count linen, the morning sun streaming through bulletproof bay windows. Dante was already gone, his side of the bed cool, carrying only the faint scent of cedar. On the bedside table sat a silver tray. It didn't hold a feather duster or cleaning supplies. It held a cup of black coffee, a dossier, and a heavy matte black secure phone. She dressed in the clothes she found in the adjoining closet, tailored slacks, and a sharp silk blouse that had appeared overnight, fitting her perfectly. She walked downstairs not as a ghost, but as a resident. The house noticed. When she entered the main dining room, the remaining maids stopped dead. They stared at her clothes, at her posture, at the undeniable fact that she was walking through the front halls instead of the service corridors. Enzo, standing by the door with a cigarette clamped between his teeth, gave her a long, dark look. "Boss is in the study," Enzo grunted, making no move to open the door for her. "Thank you, Enzo," she said, her voice perfectly level. She pushed the heavy oak doors open herself. Dante was at his desk, surrounded by a mountain of paperwork. Standing opposite him was a man Lucy hadn't seen before. He was older, with silver hair and the weathered, cynical face of a man who managed money soaked in blood. "It's a $2 million discrepancy, Dante," the older man was saying, jabbing a finger at a ledger. The routing numbers from the Dublin shipments don't match the offshore deposits. We are bleeding capital somewhere between the Irish coast and the Cayman accounts. Dante looked up as Lucy walked in. The hard lines of his face softened for a fraction of a second, an imperceptible shift that only she caught. "Matteo," Dante said, not taking his eyes off Lucy. "Give the ledger to Miss Warren." Matteo stiffened. He turned, looking Lucy up and down with blatant disrespect. "This is financial routing, Dante, not foreign languages. You don't hand syndicate ledgers to the help." "She isn't the help," Dante said, his voice dropping an octave, taking on that quiet, lethal tone that made men sweat. "Give her the ledger." Matteo's jaw clenched, but he slammed the heavy, leather-bound book onto the edge of the desk. Lucy walked over. She didn't look at Matteo. She looked at Dante. He gave her a single firm nod. She opened the ledger. It was a chaotic mess of handwritten entries, alphanumeric banking codes, and dates. It wasn't a language in the traditional sense, but numbers had a syntax. Financial laundering had a grammar. She pulled a pen from Dante's desk and started tracing the columns. It took her 3 hours. Matteo had paced the study for the first 40 minutes before Dante ordered him out, sick of the distraction. Now it was just the two of them. The study was silent except for the scratching of Lucy's pen and the occasional flick of Dante's lighter. He didn't hover. He sat on the leather sofa, going through his own files, trusting her to do the work. It was a terrifying kind of trust. If she failed, she wasn't just a bad translator. She was a liability who knew too much. She traced the shipments from Dublin. The Irish syndicate, run by a man named Callahan, moved untraceable weapons through shipping containers of industrial farm equipment. The money was supposed to be wired through a series of shell companies in Zurich before landing in Dante's accounts. But the numbers were fracturing. Lucy frowned, her finger pausing over a block of SWIFT codes. "Did you change your holding company in Geneva last month?" she asked, her voice raspy from disuse. Dante looked up from his paperwork. "No, why?" "Because the routing prefix changed on the 14th. She carried the heavy ledger over to him, dropping it on the coffee table and leaning over it. She pointed to a line of text. "Look here. This is the SWIFT code for your primary shell. It ends in 4A, but starting on the 14th, right after Callahan's second shipment cleared the docks, the destination code shifts to 4B. Dante leaned forward, his shoulder brushing hers. He stared at the numbers. 4B is a subsidiary account. It's a dormant holding. "It's not dormant anymore," Lucy said grimly. "Someone has been slicing exactly 8% off the top of every transfer and funneling it into the subsidiary. It's small enough that a casual audit wouldn't catch the missing volume, but over 6 weeks, it adds up to your 2 million. Dante's eyes darkened. "Who authorized the routing change?" "That's the interesting part," Lucy said. She flipped back 3 pages, her finger tracing a set of initials scrawled in the margin next to the authorization seal. "The banking interface is entirely in German, managed by your Munich contacts. Whoever approved this didn't just need access to your accounts. They needed to understand the German banking prompts to bypass the security delays." Dante sat back slowly. The air in the room grew heavy, suffocating. "Gavin," Dante said softly. Lucy looked at him. "Who is Gavin?" "My logistics manager. He spent 4 years running operations in Frankfurt before my father brought him to the States." Dante stared at the wall, a cold, calculating violence warring behind his eyes. "He's the only one in my inner circle who speaks the language well enough to navigate the Zurich interfaces without flagging the system." "He's stealing from you," Lucy said, stating the fact plainly. "Yes." Dante turned to look at her. His gaze was heavy, searching her face. "You just handed me a man's life, Lucy. Do you understand that?" "I handed you the truth," she replied, her chin lifting slightly. "What you do with it is your business, but I won't let you be stolen from, not when the math is right there." Dante reached out, his hand cupping the back of her neck, pulling her in. He kissed her again, slower this time, a dark, heavy promise. "Get dressed. he murmured against her lips. "We are going to the shipyards." The rain started again as Dante's black armored SUV pulled into the abandoned commercial docks on the south side of the city. The windshield wipers beat a steady, hypnotic rhythm against the glass. Lucy sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the rusted shipping containers that stacked into the sky like a metal graveyard. Her heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was no longer a spectator. She was the architect of what was about to happen. Enzo and Matteo were already there, standing beneath the harsh glare of a single halogen floodlight. Between them was Gavin. Gavin was a tall, sharply dressed man who looked entirely out of place in the mud and rust of the docks. He looked annoyed, holding a black umbrella, complaining to Enzo about the damp. Dante killed the engine. He looked at Lucy. "You can stay in the car," he said, his voice flat. "What happens next is not clean. I am the one who found the discrepancy," Lucy said, her voice shaking only slightly. "I don't hide from my own work." Dante studied her for a long moment. Then he unbuckled his seatbelt. "Stay behind me." They stepped out into the freezing rain. The moment Dante appeared, the complaining stopped. Gavin straightened up, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Boss?" Gavin said, shouting over the sound of the rain hitting the metal containers. "What's going on? Matteo pulled me out of dinner." Dante didn't answer immediately. He walked slowly until he was standing a few feet from Gavin. Lucy stood just over his right shoulder, the cold rain instantly soaking her hair, plastering her blouse to her skin. "We have a leak, Gavin," Dante said, his voice cutting through the noise of the storm like a blade. $2 million vanished between Dublin and Zurich. Gavin's face fell into an expression of practiced shock. "What? That's impossible. The routing is airtight. If Callahan's people are shorting us—" "Callahan isn't shorting us," Dante interrupted. "The money made it to Switzerland. It just took a detour into subsidiary account 4B. For a fraction of a second, Gavin's eyes widened. The panic was there, real and raw, before he buried it under a layer of indignant anger. "That's insane!" Gavin said, stepping forward. "Boss, you know the banking interfaces in Geneva. They're automated. Sometimes the clearinghouse shuffles the routing prefixes during audits. It's a systemic glitch. I'll call the bankers in the morning and have the funds consolidated." He was smooth. He was convincing. If Dante hadn't known what he was looking for, he might have believed him. Dante didn't say a word. He just stepped aside, leaving Lucy standing in plain view. Gavin looked at her, confused. He recognized her from the estate, but the context was entirely wrong. Why was the maid standing in the freezing rain at the docks? Lucy looked at Gavin. She didn't see a terrifying mafia enforcer. She saw a puzzle that she had already solved. "It wasn't a systemic glitch," Lucy said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a clear, sharp tone that carried over the rain. "The clearinghouse in Geneva operates on the ISO 15022 messaging standard for securities. A routing prefix cannot automatically shift to a dormant subsidiary without a manual MT599 authorization wire." Gavin stared at her, the blood draining from his face. "What the hell is she talking about, Dante? Who is this?" Lucy ignored him. She took a step forward. "To authorize an MT599 wire, you have to bypass the dual authentication prompt." The prompt for account 4B was sent entirely in high-level German banking terminology. Specifically, it asked for the Sicherheitsfreigabe. A systemic glitch doesn't type out a manual security clearance password, Gavin. But a man who spent 4 years running money through Frankfurt does. Silence fell over the docks, heavy and absolute, broken only by the relentless drumming of the rain. Matteo, standing off to the side, looked at Lucy as if she had just materialized from thin air. Enzo simply crossed his arms, staring at Gavin with dead eyes. Gavin's umbrella dropped to the ground. It rolled away, blown by the wind across the wet concrete. "Dante," Gavin stammered, holding his hands up, taking a step backward. "Dante, listen to me. I was going to put it back. The market shifted on the real estate deal I was running. I just needed the capital for 30 days to bridge the gap. I wasn't stealing, I was borrowing. You have to believe me. You lied to my face, Dante said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. It was a mistake! Gavin shouted, his voice cracking, panic fully taking over. He looked at Lucy, his face twisting with sudden vicious hatred. You're going to let a piece of skirt tear apart your crew. She's a nobody. She's a maid. Dante moved so fast, Lucy barely registered the shift in the air. He closed the distance between him and Gavin in 2 strides. His hand snapped out, seizing Gavin by the throat. The momentum drove Gavin backward, slamming him brutally into the corrugated steel of a shipping container. The metal boomed, echoing like thunder. Gavin choked, his hands coming up to claw at Dante's wrist, but Dante's grip was absolute. He lifted the taller man slightly off his feet, pressing him against the cold steel. She is the one who caught you, Dante whispered, leaning in so his face was inches from Gavin's. She is the one who speaks the languages you thought you could hide behind. She isn't a maid, Gavin. She is the lock on my door. And you just tried to pick it. Dante's other hand moved to his waistband. He drew a heavy, matte black pistol. Lucy stopped breathing. Her chest seized. The reality of the world she had stepped into came crashing down on her in a wave of freezing rain and industrial rust. This wasn't a puzzle anymore. This was a man's life. She could look away. She could run back to the SUV. She could close her eyes and pretend this part of Dante didn't exist, preserving her own fragile innocence. She forced her eyes to stay open. She forced herself to stand tall, the rain beating down on her shoulders. She would not flinch. If she was going to be a part of this man's life, she had to accept the blood tax that came with it. Dante didn't hesitate. He didn't monologue. He pressed the barrel of the gun to Gavin's chest and pulled the trigger. The crack of the gunshot was deafening. It split the night wide open, followed instantly by the smell of cordite mixing with the wet, salty air. Gavin's eyes went wide, wide and blank. Dante released his grip. The body slumped against the metal container, sliding down into the mud with a heavy, sickening thud. It was over. Matteo let out a long, slow breath. Enzo didn't move a muscle. Dante stood over the body for a moment, the smoking gun hanging loosely by his side. The rain washed over him, slicking his dark hair to his forehead. Slowly he turned around. He looked at Lucy. He expected horror. He expected her to be screaming, or crying, or running. He had brought her here to test her, to show her the absolute, brutal truth of who he was, fully expecting it to break the fragile bond between them. Lucy was pale. Her hands were shaking violently at her sides, but she had not moved an inch. She stood directly in the light of the halogen bulb, her eyes locked on his. She didn't look at the body. She looked at the man who had pulled the trigger. Dante walked back to her. He stopped a foot away, the smell of gunpowder clinging to his clothes. "Are you done?" she asked, her voice a thin, vibrating thread. Dante's chest heaved. He reached out, his bloody hand hovering just inches from her face, afraid to touch her, afraid to taint her. Lucy didn't retreat. She reached up, catching his wrist, her cold fingers wrapped around his forearm. She pulled his hand against her cheek, leaning into the harsh, violent reality of his touch. "I'm done," Dante rasped, the cold facade finally cracking, revealing the desperate, possessive man underneath. "Then take me home," she whispered. He dropped the gun in the mud. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her freezing body against his, burying his face in her wet hair. He held her entirely too tight, as if she were the only thing tethering him to the earth. When they walked back to the SUV, Matteo and Enzo parted to let them through. They didn't look at her with suspicion anymore. They looked at her with fear. She wasn't just the boss's woman. She was the one who had read the numbers, spoken the words, and signed the death warrant. Lucy Warren had entered the estate as a ghost. But as the heavy doors of the armored car slammed shut, sealing her in the dark with Dante Moretti, she knew she had become something else entirely. She was the queen of a very dark board, and she was exactly where she belonged. The water ran brown, then pale pink. then clear. Lucy stood under the scalding spray of the shower, her hands pressed flat against the dark slate tiles. The mud from the shipyard had caked into her hair and under her fingernails. The smell of gunpowder was stubbornly clinging to her skin, an invisible film that soap couldn't seem to touch. She didn't cry. She waited for the panic to come, for the moral revulsion to violently reject what she had witnessed. But the bathroom remained quiet. Only the hiss of the water broke the silence. She had watched a man die. She had handed over the evidence that pulled the trigger. The glass door slid open. Cold air rushed into the steam-filled stall. Dante stepped in. He was still wearing his dress trousers, ruined with rain and mud at the hems. His torso was bare. The geography of his life was mapped out in white, jagged lines of scar tissue across his ribs and shoulder. He didn't ask for permission. He stepped under the spray, crowding her, letting the hot water sluice over his own skin. He reached out and took the bar of soap from her trembling hands. "Look at me," he commanded softly. Lucy lifted her head. Her hair was plastered to her skull, her eyes wide and dark. "You didn't pull the trigger," Dante said, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones, wiping away a smear of grease. "I did. I carry the weight. You just read the numbers. The numbers were a death sentence," she whispered. The numbers were the truth. He pulled her against his chest. The heat of him was absolute, burning away the lingering chill of the docks. "In my world, a lie is a disease. If you don't cut it out, it kills the whole body. You saved my life tonight, Lucy. You saved the syndicate." He kissed her, his mouth wet and desperate, washing away the copper taste of the night. It wasn't the forceful, interrogative kiss from the boardroom. It was a surrender. The warlord was stripping off his armor in the dark, laying his neck bare to the woman who held the keys to his locked doors. The next morning, the house was a fortress. Word of Gavin's execution had spread through the ranks before dawn. The estate was locked down. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocatingly quiet. No one spoke above a murmur. Lucy walked into the study at 8 o'clock. She wore a dark grey suit, her hair pulled back into a severe knot. She wasn't carrying a duster. She was carrying a stack of banking files Matteo had surrendered to her without a word of protest. Dante was standing by the window, staring out at the manicured lawns. He turned as she entered. "The Zurich accounts," Lucy said, bypassing small talk entirely. She dropped the files onto his desk. Gavin wasn't just skimming. He was building a wall. Dante crossed the room, his expression tightening. "Explain." "The subsidiary account, 4B, isn't just a holding pen for stolen funds," Lucy said, opening the top folder. She pointed to a series of printed emails written in heavily coded German. Gavin set up a dead man's switch. He knew he was playing a dangerous game. "The account in Geneva is managed by a private banker named Bastian Adler." Gavin instructed Adler that if he failed to provide a biometric voice check every 48 hours, the account was to be locked, and the funds flagged as illicit to the Swiss Financial Authority. Dante's jaw clamped shut. A muscle feathered beneath his skin. "He weaponized the money against me. If I killed him, he burns the capital and puts federal eyes on my European roots." "Yes," Lucy said. "And the 48 hours runs out at midnight tonight in Geneva. Adler is waiting for a phone call Gavin can no longer make." "Can you hack the authorization?" Dante asked, staring at the numbers. "It's not a computer prompt," Lucy replied. "It's Swiss private banking. It requires physical presence and an override sequence. If we don't present the proper corporate officer at Adler's desk before the close of business today, he triggers the freeze." "Matteo can't go," Dante muttered, pacing the length of the rug. "He's not a listed officer on the shell company. Gavin was." "You are the primary," Lucy said softly. Dante stopped. He looked at her. "I am, but I don't speak a word of High German, and I certainly don't speak the archaic legal dialect Adler uses to draft his holding contracts. If I walk in there, he will realize Gavin is gone, he will realize I am blind to the protocol, and he will hold the 2 million hostage for a massive cut. He won't, Lucy said. She closed the folder. She looked up at the man who owned half the city. Because I am going to read the protocol for you. Dante studied her. The bruising shadows under her eyes, the sharp, intelligent set of her jaw. She was exhausted, terrified, and completely unyielding. Pack a bag, Dante said. We fly in an hour. The air in Geneva was thin and crisp, carrying the metallic scent of snow from the distant Alps. The private jet had touched down just after 1 in the afternoon local time. By 2, they were standing in the lobby of a monolithic, glass-faced building on the Rue du Rhône. This wasn't the muddy, blood-soaked reality of the shipyards. This was the pristine, sterile peak of the criminal food chain. The floors were white marble. The security guards wore tailored suits and carried concealed, suppressed weapons. Dante walked with his hands in his pockets, exuding a casual, terrifying confidence. Lucy walked a half-step behind his right shoulder. She wore a black trench coat, carrying a slim leather briefcase. To the casual observer, she was a high-end assistant. To Dante, she was the only loaded weapon in the room. They were escorted to the top floor and ushered into a massive corner office. Bastian Adler sat behind a desk made of polished, petrified wood. He was a slender man with thin, silver-rimmed glasses and the calm, bloodless demeanor of a mortician. He didn't flinch when Dante walked in. He simply checked his watch. "Mr. Moretti," Bastian said in flawless, clipped English. "This is highly irregular. Gavin usually handles the quarterly adjustments, and he is late with his check-in." Dante sat down in the leather chair opposite the desk. He didn't offer his hand. "Gavin is no longer with the organization. His employment was terminated last night." Bastian's eyes flickered. A tiny microscopic adjustment. He understood exactly what terminated meant in Dante's industry. "I see," Bastian said slowly. He folded his hands. "That presents a complication. Gavin's sudden departure triggers a security protocol on account 4B. As the fiduciary, I am legally obligated to freeze the assets pending a full internal review." "There will be no review," Dante said, his voice flat. "I am the primary shareholder of the Shell Corporation. I am here to consolidate 4B back into the main holding, effectively immediately." Bastian smiled. It was a cold, practiced expression. He switched smoothly to High German. "Unfortunately, Mr. Moretti, the bylaws of the account dictate that a freeze cannot be lifted without a sworn affidavit of release, processing fees, and a mandatory 30-day holding period." He looked at Dante, waiting for the Mafia Boss to stumble, waiting for the confusion. Dante didn't blink. He just tilted his head slightly toward Lucy. Lucy didn't sit. She stepped forward, placing her briefcase on the edge of the petrified wood desk. The lock snapped open with a sharp, echoing crack. She looked at Bastian. She didn't respond in High German. High German was the language of textbooks and formal diplomacy. Instead, she slipped flawlessly into Zürichdeutsch, the localized Swiss-German dialect used by the old money banking elite, a language of insular, unspoken power. "The bylaws you reference, Mr. Adler," Lucy said, her voice dropping into a register of icy, authoritative disdain, "only apply if the secondary officer vacates his position voluntarily. Under Section 8, Paragraph 4 of the Cantonal Banking Code, the termination of an officer due to internal corporate fraud nullifies the holding period. The funds revert instantly to the primary." Bastian froze. His mask of polite detachment shattered. He stared at the young woman in the black trench coat, utterly bewildered by the perfectly accented dialect coming out of her mouth. "Who are you?" Bastian asked, stumbling slightly over his own language. "I am the auditor who found the fraud you helped Gavin hide," Lucy replied smoothly, switching effortlessly to French, the language of Geneva's legal courts. "You didn't just manage the account, Mr. Adler. You signed off on the swift route deviations. You collected a 2% handling fee on stolen capital. That makes you an accessory to embezzlement against the Moretti syndicate." Bastian's face went chalk white. He looked at Dante, who was watching him with the dead, still eyes of a shark. "She is lying," Bastian said in English, his voice pitching up in panic. "Mr. Moretti, I am a regulated fiduciary." "Stop," Dante said quietly. The single word cut the air like a whip. Bastian clamped his mouth shut. Dante leaned forward, planting his elbows on the desk. "My auditor does not lie. If she says you took a cut, you took a cut. And you know what happened to the last man who took a cut." Bastian swallowed audibly. A bead of sweat broke out on his temple. The pristine, sterile safety of his marble tower was suddenly gone, replaced by the suffocating violence Dante carried into every room he entered. "What do you want?" Bastian whispered. Lucy pulled a single, pre-typed document from her briefcase. She slid it across the desk. "You will wire the $2 million back into the primary account," Lucy said, her tone entirely professional, entirely ruthless. "You will waive all processing fees, and you will formally assign full, unmitigated administrative control of all European holding companies directly to Mr. Moretti, removing any requirement for secondary biometric clearance." Bastian looked at the paper. It was a complete surrender. If he signed it, he gave up all his leverage. "And if I refuse?" he asked weakly. Dante smiled. It was a terrifying thing to witness. "If you refuse, I leave. And tomorrow, a very large, very untraceable car bomb will detonate in the underground parking garage of this building when you turn the key in your Mercedes. Do you understand, Mr. Adler? You are breathing right now because she—" he pointed a single finger at Lucy— "found a loophole in your paperwork. Sign it." Bastian's hand shook as he picked up his gold fountain pen. He signed the document in 3 places. He stamped it with his heavy, embossed notary seal. Lucy took the paper back. She checked the signatures, then slipped it into her briefcase, snapping the locks shut. "The wire transfer is complete," Bastian whispered, staring at his computer monitor. "Good doing business with you," Dante said. He stood up, buttoning his jacket. They walked out of the office together. The marble hallways felt different now. The tension was gone, replaced by the heavy electric hum of absolute victory. They rode the elevator down in silence. When the metal doors opened to the lobby, Dante didn't walk towards the glass exits. He turned, pinning Lucy against the polished steel wall of the elevator cab. He didn't care about the security cameras. He didn't care about the guards. He crushed his mouth against hers, his hands diving into her hair, pulling the severe knot loose. Lucy gasped, dropping the briefcase. It hit the floor with a heavy thud. Her hands grabbed the lapels of his jacket, pulling him closer, matching his desperate, violent heat. The adrenaline of the standoff in the office was boiling in her veins. She hadn't just survived the warlord's world, she had conquered a piece of it. "Mine!" Dante breathed against her neck, his voice a ragged, possessive growl. "Every word in your head, every breath in your lungs, mine." "Yours," she promised, the word a vow sealed in the dark. The flight back to the estate was a blur of altitude and exhaustion. When the armored SUV finally pulled through the iron gates of the Moretti compound, it was nearly 3 a.m. The rain had returned, a soft, steady drizzle that washed the city clean. The massive oak doors of the house swung open. Enzo stood in the foyer. He looked at Dante. Then he looked down at the leather briefcase in Lucy's hand. Enzo didn't sneer. He didn't look at her with suspicion. He simply stepped back, bowed his head slightly, and took the heavy trench coat from her shoulders. It was a quiet, undeniable gesture of absolute submission. The hierarchy of the house had shifted permanently. "The Zurich accounts are consolidated," Dante told Enzo, his voice echoing in the grand hall. "Gavin's access points are burned. Put out a directive to the capos. Anyone attempting to bypass the new routing protocols will answer to me directly." "Understood, boss," Enzo grunted. He glanced at Lucy again, respect burning clear in his dark eyes. "Welcome back, Miss Warren." Lucy nodded slightly. "Thank you, Enzo." They walked up the grand staircase. Not toward the servants' quarters, not toward the guest wing. They walked directly to the master suite at the end of the hall. The room was dark, illuminated only by the amber glow of the city lights bleeding through the massive windows. Dante shrugged off his jacket, tossing it over a chair. He loosened his tie, the armor finally coming completely off. Lucy set the briefcase on the heavy wooden dresser. She looked around the room. 3 days ago she had been scrubbing the baseboards in this very space, terrified of making a sound, terrified of the man who slept in the massive bed. Now she was standing in the center of the room, and the man was watching her like she was the only oxygen left in the atmosphere. "You're quiet," Dante said, walking up behind her. He didn't touch her yet. He just stood close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "I'm translating," she murmured, staring out at the rain-slicked city. "Translating what?" "The shift." She turned around to face him. She was exhausted, her silk blouse wrinkled, her hair a messy cascade over her shoulders. But her eyes were sharp, bright, and utterly fearless. "My father died owing this syndicate a debt he could never repay. I spent 8 months terrified of the shadows in this house, and today I threatened a Swiss banker and helped secure $2 million in laundered money. Are you regretting it?" Dante asked softly, his jaw tightening. "No." Lucy stepped closer, closing the final inch between them. She placed her hands flat against his chest, right over his heart. Its rhythm was slow, steady, powerful. "I don't regret it. I just realized that I'm not the wallflower anymore. I'm not the maid." Dante's hands came up, cupping her face. His thumbs brushed gently over her cheekbones, a stark contrast to the brutal violence his hands were capable of. "You were never a maid, Lucy," he said, his voice a low, dark hum in the quiet room. "You were just waiting for the right war, and you found it." He didn't kiss her with the frantic desperation of the elevator or the crushing dominance of the boardroom. He kissed her slowly, deliberately, savoring the taste of her, the absolute victory of having her completely. He backed her gently toward the edge of the bed, the mattress pressing against the back of her knees. The power dynamic in the room was entirely balanced. He was the warlord, the muscle, the iron fist that crushed their enemies. But she was the architect, the strategist, the mind that saw the traps before they could spring. They were two halves of a terrifying whole. As Dante laid her back against the pillows, the shadows of the estate finally felt quiet. The ghosts was gone, the ledgers were clean. Lucy wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him down into the dark. She didn't need to speak Russian, or French or Spanish to understand what was happening. This was a language of survival, a language of power, and for the first time in her life, she was fluent. If you were captivated by Lucy's incredible transformation from a silent wallflower into the brilliant, bilingual queen of the Moretti Syndicate, you need to hit that like button right now. This story proves that true power isn't just about muscle, it's about outsmarting the enemy when they least expect it. Don't keep this intense audio drama to yourself. Share this video with your friends who love a dark, romantic thriller where the heroine completely steals the show.